Dr. Cynthia Boaz is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Sonoma State University, where her areas of expertise include political development and quality of democracy, nonviolent conflict and nonviolent struggle, and political communication with an emphasis on media coverage of war. Her work has appeared in numerous academic journals, including Peace Review, a journal of social justice, Feminist Media Studies, Comparative Political Studies, and Sojourners Magazine. She has also contributed chapters to several books on nonviolent action and social movements. Dr. Boaz is an affiliated scholar at the UNESCO Chair of Philosophy Master's Program in Peace, Conflict, and Development Studies at Castellón de Plana, Spain. She is also on the board of directors at the Meta Center for Nonviolence Education and at the Project Censored Media Freedom Foundation. She was also recently appointed to the board of advisors for Truth Out, for whom she is also a contributing writer. Dr. Boaz is also a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, where she often writes about challenges to and quality of democracy in Iran and the United States. Dr. Boaz is the associate editor of the Peace and Change Journal, the collaborative journal of the Peace History Association, and the Peace and Justice Studies Association. She was the opening speaker at the 2009 M.K. Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence annual conference at the University of Rochester, and in the past several weeks has led workshops or given talks on nonviolent action in India, Vancouver, Boulder, Colorado, New Orleans, Louisiana, San Francisco, California, and Atlanta, Georgia. Boaz has recently been referenced or interviewed for her knowledge on strategic nonviolent conflict, and particularly Burma's Saffron Revolution and Iran's Green Revolution, by international media, including the BBC and the International Herald Tribune. Last October, she interviewed Iranian Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi about the women-led movement in that country. Boaz remains an activist working with several international human rights organizations, such as the U.S. Campaign for Burma, and she is also an academic advisor for ICNC. With that, I'll hand it over to our presenter, Dr. Cynthia Boaz.
Thanks, Darren. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined the webinar this morning. I'm looking forward to a great discussion, and I'm honored that you're taking time out of your morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, to be with us today. I would love it if it's possible. I'm not 100% sure how these webinars work, but if every once in a while someone can just give me a heads up that they're there on the chat or with the hand raised, because it's sort of strange to just be speaking without any feedback. Before I begin the content of the presentation, I know a couple of people were curious about the title, Swallowing Camels. That was actually suggested from a friend of mine. It comes from a biblical parable that references the Pharisees' tendency to strain gnats, the smallest unclean animal, from the drinking water, while they ignored their close associations with the camel. And the camel was considered to be the largest unclean animal. So the parable referenced the notion that in focusing on the minor details, in this case of the law, while neglecting the more important principles like justice and mercy, the Pharisees were in effect straining gnats and swallowing camels. So that's the approach I'm using regarding media's focus on nonviolent struggles. So I just want to say a couple words about how I became interested in this topic originally. Back in the fall of 2007, I found myself in a very unusual position of being placed between the events actually unfolding on the ground in Burma. If you remember, in September and October of that year, there were a series of large rallies and protests taking place in Rangoon and Mandalay and other cities in Burma, mostly led by monks. And it just so happened that that semester at SUNY Brockport, I had a student who was actively involved in the struggle there as kind of a translator and former movement leader from the 1988 uprising. So he was getting information from inside the country, and then, but it was in Burmese, and he would translate it into English and then give it to me. And here I would have this fresh, instantaneous information on tactics and actions being taken inside the country that no one else had. And so I started writing a series of articles, mostly for Truth Out, on these actions and tactics, just trying to keep the world sort of up to date on what was going on. And at that same time, I started to look around and see what other international media were saying about the struggle inside Burma and what meaning they were giving to the events inside that country. Excuse me, and the gap between the things that I was being told from activists about what was going on and then the ways in which media, including in some cases very quality media like BBC and International Herald Tribune, were covering this story, and the context that they were giving to it was just shocking. So that observation was what really kicked off my interests in this particular topic. So I'm going to return to some examples from that case, but first I want to give a little bit of background on the core dynamic here, which is civil resistance, or what ICNC sometimes calls strategic nonviolent conflict. We can also call it nonviolent action. Nonviolent conflict is, in a nutshell, it's a method by which ordinary people come together and then mobilize together to fight for their rights or to promote democracy or justice using disruptive actions, but without using violence. And nonviolent conflict can take a number of different forms, including protest, which is usually the most visible form, the form that's usually defaulted to in media, where we see people showing up at rallies, marches, vigils, and so on. But there are also a number of less visible means, including different forms of non-cooperation, nonviolent intervention, and the bottom line with all the different forms of nonviolent conflict is that the activists and the members of the movement are withdrawing their support for whatever system of injustice or oppression is in place. So disobedience is at the heart of nonviolent resistance. The way in which nonviolent action actually shifts power from oppressive rulers to civilian democratic rule is sort of threefold. Through nonviolent action, a broad-based civic movement comes together to drive up the cost of repression, both in terms of literal economic costs or resources, but also in terms of legitimacy and support. And they thereby reduce the economic and political support, as well as moral authority, that an oppressor needs to keep control. And the second stage is when people collectively begin to visibly deprive a ruler of their consent. It reduces that ruler's power and legitimacy, which has a snowball effect. And then lastly, once the system's own defenders begin to doubt whether it can survive, and these are the folks and institutions that fall into the category of what are sometimes called pillars of support or pillars of power, when they're undermined and the system's defenders, like the security forces, for example, begin to shift their loyalties away from the oppressor to the people, then eventually the balance of power shifts to those using civilian-based resistance. And then the movement and the method's legitimacy increases, opening up political space for genuine democracy. So a key observation to note about this core dynamic is that power has to be understood as bottom-up in this phenomenon, as well as pluralistic. But I'll return to those two concepts in a minute. There are a number of common misconceptions or misunderstandings about nonviolent struggles and nonviolent action and the way that the dynamic works. Many of these are derived directly from the ways in which media covers nonviolent struggles, and specifically the ways in which certain concepts like power and violence are framed. So I'm guessing that most of you will be familiar with most of these misconceptions. Maybe you even share some of them. They might be interesting to talk about at the end of the session if you have any follow-up questions on these. But briefly, none of these following misconceptions, which are pervasive, are valid or really hold water. But the first common misconception is that nonviolent action is inaction, or the avoidance of conflict, passivity, or passive resistance. In fact, nonviolent action, nonviolent conflict are very proactive forces. Gandhi even referred to nonviolent action as the most activist force in the world. A second common misconception is that nonviolent action is only used as a last resort when the means of violence are unavailable to the movement, which implies that that violence is the more powerful means of exerting force or influence. So that misconception actually reinforces one of these other misconceptions, which is that that violence or repression works. Another common misconception is that the occurrence or even success of nonviolent action or movements is determined by structural conditions, things exogenous to the movement itself, like culture or the economic system or the geopolitical location of the state in which the action is taking place, and so on. There's a new emerging body of work coming out on this set of questions, comparing, sometimes we call them skills versus conditions, or structure versus agency, regarding the success and failure of nonviolent movements. But thus far, the evidence comes down very firmly on the side of skills and agency over structure and conditions, meaning that nonviolent action can theoretically take place and theoretically be successful anywhere. Another common misconception is that the effectiveness of nonviolent action is a direct function of the ideology or repressiveness of the oppressors themselves. And we hear this all the time. I hear it in classes when I talk about the core dynamic. Student immediately raises their hand and says, "Oh, that's all great, but it would never have worked against Hitler. He was too violent or too brutal." And we sometimes hear that conventional wisdom from policymakers who say that so-and-so only responds to violence or only understands violence. But in fact, there are a number of case studies that demonstrate that it's in some of the most repressive places where movements have been the most successful. And there does not empirically appear to be a connection, a strong connection between the repressiveness of the oppressors and the success of the movement. And then another misconception is that participation in nonviolent action itself requires the holding of a set of ideological or philosophical beliefs. Not true. Anyone can participate in nonviolent action. You don't need to believe in any particular ideology, philosophy, religion, morality, etc. And then finally, the misconception that nonviolent campaigns always need a charismatic leader, a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King Jr. to succeed. It is true to say that movements need leadership, but this particular misconception is one that I think is dangerously perpetuated within media. If we can't see one key strong, charismatic leader with whom media can check in with, then we assume that there's no leadership in the movement, and that is erroneous. Okay, so I wanted to ask everyone who's participating to take a look at this photograph. This was from the fall 2007 Burmese uprising, and you see monks and security forces facing down one another. And I want to ask you to think about what do you see when you look at this photo of these Buddhist monks juxtaposed with the security forces? Who do you assume here is confronting whom? Do you make any implicit assumptions when you look at this photograph? Now, to the extent that we, as a media audience, make assumptions, they're usually driven by what I call MetaFrames, these deeply embedded, transcending, universal statements about elements of reality that are found in media coverage of the phenomenon. So ask yourself, when you look at this photo, do you see organized or spontaneous action by people? Do you see victims or empowered action takers? Do you see externally driven or indigenous events? Do you see chaos or strategy, hope or demoralization? Do you see violence or nonviolence? And do you see success or failure? As I mentioned previously with the story about Burma, the gaps between mainstream media's frames on the stories emerging from places like Iran and Burma and elsewhere, and the reality on the ground can be breathtaking. Media frames can reinforce key distortions in our knowledge about struggles, and they can subsequently even default to the perspective of the oppressor, which then has the potential to go on and undermine the movement or campaign, and even unwittingly enable brutality and oppression to continue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this works using something called frame analysis. A media frame helps us form a cognitive structure around our perceptions of reality. It determines what parts of a news story we find most significant, and it helps us draw subconscious but sometimes deeply embedded conclusions about the meaning behind the events in a story. Now, because media and media audiences tend to be so obsessed with violence, the context and significance underlying the events, like the ones that took place in Iran last summer or in Burma in the fall of 2007, are often misinterpreted. And because the wrong or less interesting but more sensational elements of the story are emphasized, while others are downplayed, erroneous or incomplete conclusions can emerge. And often these conclusions can have the consequence of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. To draw from the work of George Lakoff, who's sort of the founding father of contemporary frame analysis, frames can also be thought of as metaphors that serve to structure our understanding of the world around us. And importantly, they not only aid us in structuring our experience, but they can work to influence how others structure their experience as well. So what this tells us is that a skillful use of frames can actually cause others to share your particular worldview, either intentionally or unintentionally. So think about what happens, for example, when Iranian democracy activists, let's say last summer, caught a glimpse of a CNN headline that said something like, Ahmadinejad victorious in Iranian elections, or that referred to Mousavi as the defeated challenger. and say that these things took place at the height of the resistance to the stolen election, in the midst of the Green Revolution events. Activists would then be understandably likely to conclude that the regime's attempt at a coup had succeeded, and that would in turn dampen their enthusiasm and morale, which would cause some in the movement to give up their resistance, and worse, could cause others to turn to violent means, a last desperate resort to fight back. Although occasionally media frames are consciously manufactured, and all you really need to do is to look at anything on the Fox News channel for evidence of that, the conventional wisdom suggests that the major culprit is the inability or unwillingness of reporters to engage in serious investigative or assiduous on-the-ground reporting. And that can be extraordinarily frustrating for members of a nonviolent democracy struggle who, in addition to everything else, find themselves in the midst of an uprising having to unspin erroneous media coverage coming from all directions. So I'm going to now go through 4 other techniques or types of media bias that help shape public perceptions of civil resistance, and all of which have been used to report the stories both from Iran and Burma, as with elsewhere. So the first one is called fragmentation. The fragmentation bias involves covering a story in isolated and sometimes seemingly unrelated pieces. So at its worst, a story through the fragmentation lens is completely removed of its larger historical or political context. These stories tend to suggest pandemonium, isolated acts of extremist political violence, and a regime struggling to, quote, normalize the situation. So when taken together, and especially with the usual corresponding photographs, these smaller stories paint a picture of countries in chaos, prone, in the Iranian case, to violent theocratic extremism, and awash in repression. And while each of these taken out of context may have some veracity, the reality is much richer and more potentially encouraging. The Green Revolution last summer was not just a series of ad hoc protests against a political theft. It was a story of widespread resistance to ongoing repression. And it wasn't the repression and violence that was most interesting about the news coming from Iran. It was that people continued to resist despite the repression. But that message would have been hard to ascertain from the news coverage using that fragmentation lens. A second technique that I want to mention, and sorry I moved my slide ahead before I meant to, excuse me, is called dramatization. The dramatization bias occurs when news is encapsulated in short sensationalistic bits that are intended specifically to provoke an emotional response on the part of the news audience. But in the absence of serious analysis on the policy issues, the institutional interplay, or the larger social setting. Dramatization thrives on confusion and skepticism, and it tends to produce conclusions that bend toward the cynical. For example, a dramatization bias might cover a massive protest against rigged votes as, quote, a spontaneous mass uprising, suggesting that it is not part of a larger systemic strategy, and essentially leading the media audience to conclude that it's just a one-off, a temporary and reflexive response to immediate political events. And this kind of conclusion could go on to create a global perception that there's nothing, no movement or struggle with which to demonstrate solidarity. The dramatization bias also tends to lead to overemphasis on the visual drama in a story, which can then go on to sensationalize the wrong parts of the story. And this usually takes place around victims of violence. And then a third technique or bias I'd like to mention is called euphemism. Euphemism plays a dangerous role in the way that civil resistance is covered. And I would argue that is especially when the resistance takes place in a non-Western country. The terminology used to describe the images of thousands of people on the streets often erroneously connotes improvised and anarchic action, when in fact, in many cases, the movement itself may be strategic, organized, and disciplined. For example, a headline next to a photo of the largest demonstration in Tehran last June, and I believe this came from MSNBC, but it was not unique to them, simply said, "huge crowds in Iran," a statement which, while technically correct, is incomplete. A crowd connotes any large group of people congregated together, sometimes randomly, and for no specific reason. But what was happening on the streets of Iran was much more sophisticated than a convergence of crowds. It was a massive, nonviolent civilian uprising that everyone, save most of the American mainstream media, seems to take seriously as a potential force for change. And then the last technique I'd like to mention is called the authority disorder bias, where information is sparse or of questionable veracity, and in a situation where official forces are being challenged by civil society forces, media tend to default to the perspective of the officials. And this is regardless of regime type, ideology, and even of the relationship between the country in which that media exists and the country in which the resistance is taking place. There's a second part to the authority disorder bias, which is that once the crisis is presented through the lens of government or through officials, then it's government themselves that offers the perceived solution to the crisis, even if ultimately they're responsible for it. So a common example of this is when the Burmese junta or the Iranian regime told the world that they were, quote, restoring order to their countries in response to these massive acts of resistance. So even when the phrasing on the part of the media is something like the Iranian regime claims to be restoring normalcy, there's still an inherent default to accept the veracity of the claim, especially when the story ends on that quote or ends with paraphrasing the perspective of the oppressor. In addition to conscious attempts at framing or the use of these other techniques that I've mentioned, there are a series of additional culprits that contribute to or reinforce the misunderstandings and erroneous assumptions about the dynamics of nonviolent action. These include, as I mentioned earlier, a real lack of assiduous on-the-ground reporting in a lot of these countries, and oftentimes that's due to the fact that the resistance in which the country is taking place is closed and difficult for journalists or reporters to get into. And likewise, difficult for activists or journalists, native journalists inside the country to get information out of. There also, more generally, is a lack of understanding of subject matter or expertise on the dynamic of nonviolent action, especially in mainstream for-profit media, which makes it difficult for them to convey these stories effectively. There's also, relatedly, a lack of a grasp of the larger context, especially the historical context in which these struggles are taking place, which again makes it difficult for them to tell these stories comprehensively and authentically. And then, I hate to say it, but there's also some degree of intellectual or journalistic laziness, where the temptation is to default to the perspective of the oppressor or to the first or most vocal actor or source that steps up to weigh in on the struggle. Okay, so based on all of these different techniques and the original misconceptions that I introduced, the common misconceptions about nonviolent action, I would argue that there are also a handful of almost universal MetaFrames, these transcending, comprehensive, universal assumptions that exist sort of behind or prior to the specific misconceptions about nonviolent action. And I would ask you to think about what are the larger consequences of these frames, both in terms of what you know about nonviolent action and what you understand or perceive about concepts like power and violence. So the most common MetaFrames, as I see them, include the notion that repression or violence is more interesting than resistance. So I sort of already mentioned this regarding the Burmese case, but this was also relevant with the coverage from Iran. When the story was covered, and even when the massive resistance was discussed, it was always against the background of the anticipated repression. When was the violence going to take place? When was the crackdown going to happen? And the underlying assumption there was that once that took place, the resistance would be over. There's also the pervasive assumption that power is top-down. And if that's how you understand power cognitively, it makes it very, very difficult both to really grasp and understand the dynamic of nonviolent action and to understand the errors and the incompleteness in the way in which these media stories are being covered. If you understand power as something that happens to you rather than something you exert, then the tendency is to default to that more disempowering lens. There's also a common frame that power is monolithic, but nonviolent action requires that we understand power as pluralistic and as something that can really only be exerted when people come together, organize, and then force change. There's also a common frame that conflict itself is undesirable, and that is a frame that we who study this phenomenon and organizations like ICNC work hard to dispel. To return to those original misconceptions about nonviolent action, one of the assumptions that's often made about the work that we do is that we engage in conflict resolution. The conflict resolution is the same as nonviolent action, but that's in fact not the case. I would even argue that that's opposite of the case. We assume that conflict is and can be inherently necessary and even good for democracy. So what we study is the waging of conflict nonviolently in order to produce change and produce more justice or equality or rights. Another common metaframe is the notion that successful campaigns are accidents of history, that they had nothing to do with strategy or with anything the movement was doing, but that the movement got lucky. And then lastly, a common metaframe is that violence is the most effective means of waging conflict, and this returns to reinforce one of those original misconceptions that nonviolent action is a last resort. So collectively, all of these metaframes together contribute to a key assumption that victories for nonviolent movements are not in the hands of the movement, but in the oppressor or in the hands of external actors or circumstances outside of the movement's control. So taken together, these frames can be incredibly disempowering. So I'm assuming that most of the audience listening to the webinar understands that the empirical reality is not consistent with the misconceptions, that nonviolent struggles succeed far more frequently than armed insurrections in contemporary campaigns for rights and democracy. We could be happy to go into some of the recent work there. Okay, so given all of this knowledge and understanding about frames and how they work and how they create these larger metaframes and misconceptions about nonviolent action, the question becomes, what can conscious global citizens and media audiences and even activists do to counter these and other disempowering frames? So I'm just going to offer a few suggestions, but I would love it in the discussion portion if some of you could offer some of your own suggestions as well. I think this is an area of both research and action that needs to be explored in more depth. So the first suggestion I would make is that you need to be a more conscious consumer of media, starting with just being aware of the frames themselves, and that's really half the battle. Propaganda is really only effective when people don't know that they're being propagandized. Secondly, ask if the frame's assumptions are valid. Sometimes they are, sometimes they might be, but many times they are not. In response to erroneous frames, I would ask that those of us who engage in scholarship and analysis of nonviolent action make sure that we use accurate language consistently to reframe or unspin some of the erroneous coverage and perceptions coming out of these struggles. And there's a real role for what Al Giordano calls media from below, or authentic journalism, where what I would call citizen journalists, people on the ground, activists, and authentic journalists can use various tools at their disposal to counter some of the ways in which media is erroneously framing this phenomenon. So some good examples would be the use of Twitter during Iran's Green Revolution last summer. And it was a really extraordinary test of that medium, that micro-blogging service. So the regime would be saying one thing about what was happening in the country, and then 500,000 independent tweeters or Twitterers would be saying something else consistent with one another. And just the sheer number and scope of those independent reports made the regime's claims seem ridiculous. So there are ways in which movements who have access to these different social media networking services can really use them to their advantage to organize and to get their own stories out. Another good example is video journalism. I highly recommend viewing the film Burma VJ, if you haven't seen that yet, for a really touching inside look at how video can be used to tell the story from inside the country. And then, of course, there's blogging and you know, many other ways that independent journalists can get the story out. So to wrap it up, I just want to take a second to reflect on the ideal. What would media coverage in the ideal look like? Well, despite the conventional wisdom, the Iranian, Burmese, and other stories related to civil resistance, they weren't stories about successful repression, they weren't really stories about violence, and nor were they really stories about the cultural preference of Iranians or Burmese for autocracy or theocracy. They were stories about courageous, massive resistance to oppression and injustice. And responsible democratic media and conscious citizens should recognize and tell the stories that way, both on behalf of those who are resisting and those who are observing. So in the ideal, media coverage would tell these stories from the perspectives of those doing the resisting, not from those doing the repression. In other words, movements and activists should own and tell their own stories. And then lastly, I'd like to offer some further resources on framing and the ways in which media is used to distort these phenomena that we've been talking about and other related ones. And I'd be happy to follow up further with any of you on this topic. So thank you very much for giving me 42 minutes of your morning.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Boaz, for a great presentation. We'll open it up now to questions from the attendees. And Dr. Boaz, I'll remind you, you'll still be sharing your screen, so if you want to go back and reference previous slides, you should be able to do that. Our first one comes from Lisa Berkeley. Please introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you for an excellent presentation. My question for you was, do you know of any organization or individual who are teaching mainstream media to reframe their writings as far as cultural relevance or any of the other subjects you've discussed?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know of any organizations that are teaching any media institutions themselves. There are several organizations that kind of solicit or work with journalists, independent reporters, writers who are seeking out this information on their own. And some of them I put up at the end of my slideshow here. I'll bring the slide back up. But Cognitive Policy Works is one organization that provides a number of tools for journalists and reporters. Center for Media and Democracy, which was founded by Rampton and Stauber, the authors of Weapons of Mass Deception, also does that. But no, I don't know of any organizations that work with any media organizations specifically, and my guess is that that is because most mainstream media organizations have no real incentive to address this.
Our next question then comes from Paul Schwartzentruber. Please introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
Hi, I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. I got stuck on one of the misconceptions you talked about, and I guess this comes out of my experience working with Gandhian nonviolent movement in India. So I want to ask, regarding the notion that there are no particular beliefs necessary for nonviolence, it seems to me that the refusal to collude in injustice and the willingness to accept suffering rather than commit counter-violence always imply some kind of sophisticated belief or value system, even if it's not articulated. So I wonder if you could
Well, I
comment
think
on just.
yeah, the willingness to,
Okay.
Tell me again how you phrased the first part of that. You said the willingness to reject,
Well, a
or
refusal to collude
refuse to be
in
collusive.
injustice.
Um, that I think is universal, universally necessary in a successful struggle, and that willingness or dedication to withdrawing consent for that system of injustice is required on the part of all activists and members of a movement. And so I do agree with that. I don't know that I agree that it's necessarily a a philosophical or ideological or other kind of shared set of beliefs. I mean, I guess I would make a distinction between things that people in the movement understand that are necessary in order for a struggle to succeed, which would include withdrawing one's consent, versus beliefs about religious or philosophical, ideological perceptions, worldviews. And the reason that this distinction is made is because if we convey the notion that engaging in nonviolent action requires a certain set of beliefs or principles beyond the ones that you just introduced, there's a tendency to exclude potential participants in the movement. If people, for example, believe that they have to, in Burma, if they believe that they have to be Buddhist to be a part of the movement, or they have to share certain assumptions about living a life of principled nonviolence, then they're going to be less inclined to join the struggle because they believe that there's kind of a litmus test or certain criteria necessary to participate. And what I was trying to convey is that that's not really the case. In order to participate in the movement, you simply have to believe that injustice exists and that you have a responsibility for joining in the struggle to undermine that injustice. But I do understand that there's some disagreement on this issue, so I'll concede that.
Thanks for your question, Paul. Our next question comes from Lee Smithy. Please introduce yourself and go ahead with your question.
Hi, Cindy. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I'm
Great.
glad you're here.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thanks so much for offering it for. The question I got was just, do you find that there are some tactics or classes of tactics maybe that for some reason seem less susceptible to these problems of fragmentation and dramatization and the MetaFrames that you talked about? And if so, why? And I was also just going to throw out that you're probably familiar, or others out there listening might be familiar, but there's a fairly new but growing literature on peace journalism that I think maybe addresses some of these issues from the journalistic side. And someone's question or comment earlier about training for organizations made me think about the way in which some journalists and scholars of journalism are starting to try to, at least in a kind of educational fashion, address some of these problems. But again, thanks so much for your talk, and I look forward to hearing your comment.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I hadn't even thought about that, but you're right. Within the academic world, especially, there is a growing movement or attempt to figure out ways to write about this phenomenon that are much more authentic and respectful of the stories on the ground, the activists and movements perspective. And I believe that next month, or in July, at the International Peace Research Association, there's going to be several panels where we'll be talking about this with people engaged in or interested in getting engaged in peace journalism. So I assume your question was about about actions or tactics that movements use that are less susceptible to misunderstanding or erroneous framing. It's an interesting question. I would say that it's those tactics and actions that are less visible or less conventional and less common that might be less susceptible to misunderstanding, because if there's I would guess that if there's absolutely no frame of reference upon which a media analyst can give commentary or perspective on an action, that it's going to be necessary for them to find someone who can give an appropriate context. So it's hard to think of specific actions. Maybe creative acts of non-cooperation involving political or economic sanction. Those things might be a little bit more difficult to misportray than people pouring out onto the streets in a center square, or the response to that on the part of the regime. But that's an interesting question.
Great, thanks for your question, Lee. Our next question comes from Qasser Ahmed. Qasser Ahmed asks, how do you view the latest Thai protest in light of nonviolent methods? Do you believe that they lost due to their use of violence?
Well, first of all, I have to confess, I haven't been following that series of protests as closely as I should be. I just haven't had the time at the end of the semester to be observing it, as closely as I'd like. But that being said, yeah, in my view, it's going to be very difficult for a movement, any movement, and this includes in the Thai case, that has decided to introduce any use of violence into their struggle to succeed as a nonviolent movement. And I would argue it's difficult to succeed overall through the use of armed struggle, especially contemporarily. But I don't think that necessarily means that it's too late. Sorry. Sorry, if you're looking at my screen, I'm trying to do two things at once here. I don't think that it's necessarily too late for a movement to organize and engage in strategic nonviolent action, but I do think that recent events are setback. Yes.
Okay, we have time for two more questions, and I'll read them from the dialog box. And I do want to remind everybody that if you did not get an opportunity to ask your question or have your question read out, that all questions that were written in will be sent to Dr. Boaz. And if you have a question that you didn't get to ask, you can email that question to webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and we will forward those to her. So our next question comes from Tyler Peterson, and he writes, does the new media landscape, internet, citizen reporting, etc., help eliminate / mitigate or exacerbate some of the problems you describe with mainstream media reports?
Well, there's no consensus on this yet. And the reality is that oppressors, regimes themselves can theoretically use these same tools. You know, they can figure out how to tweet and engage in disinformation campaigns that way. Everybody knows the Iranian regime was doing that last summer. So theoretically, oppressors can use these new media tools to continue to engage in the type of propagandizing that they've always done, and these tools can, of course, be subject to the same types of techniques that I've already mentioned. But overall, I would default to the view that new media holds probably the best potential for countering these various techniques. And I think that it has something to do with this notion of media from below that I mentioned towards the end of the presentation. You know, the idea that journalism and writing about these stories can and should be a very self-selecting kind of process. In other words, those who are engaging in these analyses are people who are genuinely interested in the phenomenon and who are genuinely interested or even involved in what's happening within these countries and these contexts. And I think that some of these social media, especially Twitter, ironic given you know, the brevity of the microblogging medium, has the ability to organically filter out inauthenticity and reward truth, consistency, you know, validity, and so on. But I think that the process, because it's essentially organic and is still relatively new, will take some time. So, but overall I would say yes, I definitely think those media are less susceptible to
Great, thanks for your question, Tyler. Our last question will come from Lester Kurtz. Please go ahead, introduce yourself, and go ahead with your question.
Hi.
Hey, Les.
Andy.
Hey, Les.
Say, I was thinking there was a kind of relevant flip side to the misconceptions of nonviolence in the press, and that's the conceptions of violence. And I was reading a piece this morning by Robert Fisk in an Al Jazeera forum, and he was talking about how the media would pick up on terms that are actually invented by the Pentagon. And a couple of them, like he talked about a spike, which assumes that the violence is going to go up and then quickly back down again, and a surge, which sounds like it's like some sort of dramatic positive movement, but it's actually referring to reinforcements, which you send in when you're losing. And so I was thinking that wanted to see what you thought about if there are ways that sort of civil resistance movements should be aware also of how the violence that they're opposing is being misrepresented, and how can we avoid sort of being misled by the media in developing our own strategies for dealing with that violence.
Oh, that's a huge question. That's a whole other body of research. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that as conscious media consumers, we do have to be aware not just of how these movements and struggles of use of nonviolent action are being portrayed, but you're right about how violent action, war, you know, foreign policy related to the use of force, and how all that is being portrayed and justified. Either the Rampton and Stauber book that I mentioned at the end of the slideshow has a number of really interesting examples along the lines of some of the euphemisms and terminology that you just introduced, and their study is specifically on the Iraq invasion and around the first year of the U.S. Occupation of Iraq between 2003 and 2004. But anyway, yes, I do think that conscious audiences, you know, those of us who are interested in this phenomenon, and activists do need to also be owning the terminology. You know, we need to be finding ways to name these phenomena for ourselves, and then you know, there are different ways in which the terminology and the rhetoric can be disseminated. through communications mechanisms, through movements, through media. But I think that the key tactic is really pretty simple, and that's what George Lakoff calls saturation, where we keep using the same, in this case, authentic terminology over and over, so that we are essentially reframing these notions of things like violence or force or perceived validity or justifiability of war, and so on. So I do think that, yeah, conscious activists and movements do need to be doing this simultaneously with, authentically and forcefully telling their own stories from their own perspectives. They also do need to be rejecting conventional wisdom about violence and its effectiveness.
Great. Dr. Boaz, thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and thanks to everyone who logged in today and participated. I again want to remind folks that if you didn't get an opportunity to ask a question, please email webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and we will email those questions or comments to our presenter. Dr. Boaz, do you have any concluding remarks?
Oh, I'm just really grateful that so many people stuck around. Let's see, we have 44 people still here until 10:10. It was really fun for me, and I'm sorry that I didn't get to talk to everybody, but I hope that anybody who's interested in talking about this further gets in contact. This is a relatively new area of study, and if you're interested in collaborating, get a hold of me.